If history has taught us anything, it is that all things eventually become history. The first time I ever went to New York City was October of 2003. Went with an associate, lived in Kansas City. I'd always lived in what are regarded as fairly big cities. Grew up in Memphis and then lived in Kansas City, cities of about 1 million people. And yet, although I'd seen New York City on TV, there's nothing like being there, is there? You go and you see the magnificence of the skyline and stand at the base of these buildings, and you just are in awe of all of it. And of course, we were tourists, and so we go up to the top of the Empire State Building, and we look all around, and finally, inevitably look south into South Manhattan, where just over 2 years before that, there had before been 2 massive twin towers overseeing it all. And yet they were gone. We made a pilgrimage, as you do, to where those buildings stood. There was no memorial at the time. There was still wreckage everywhere. And you could just not imagine these holes left where these 2 giant structures had been. But even without them, the entire place, all of the structures, all of the buildings were beyond measure, at least to 2 guys from Kansas City. Of course, if you had talked to my grandparents from Kansas, who lived, like at a place where there was not even a tree around, just like the 2 of them and a cow, they would come to Kansas City and they couldn't believe that. I'm surprised they didn't, spontaneously, jump into song from that, song about Kansas City from Oklahoma, where the bumpkin makes his way into Kansas City and he says, everything's up to date in Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. They went and built a skyscraper almost 7 stories tall. As high as a building ought to go. Everything's like a dream in Kansas City. Yeah, they've gone about as far as they can go. By the way, Kansas City has buildings now way bigger than 7 stories. But you get the point. We went from Kansas City to there, and we're all. They went from Kansas to Kansas City, and we're in awe. While I was thinking about this week, I realized that, of course, Oklahoma's a Broadway hit. So they sang that song about Kansas City on Broadway, in Times Square area, in the midst of all these buildings, and they sang about, this skyscraper almost 7 stories tall, and I'm sure they all giggled. Because look at all the structures around them. In fact, you could at that time just look south at those 2 structures. It looked eternal and forever and could never be touched or fall. This is basically what the gospel is describing with the disciples. They are from the first century Israeli version of the boonies. That's what the Galilee is, where Jesus does his ministry. It's in the middle of nowhere. And they've made their way to Jerusalem. And they see the temple and its immensity and these massive tons, worth of stones laid upon one another, and they take great pride in it. I've described before that the only way to understand or even come close to understanding what the temple meant to these Jewish people would be like if we wrapped up the White House and the Congress and the Supreme Court and the National Cathedral all in one. We might approach how they felt about that temple. And they had never seen anything like it. And they took pride in it, because it was obviously and completely, inevitably to their eyes, eternal. And Jesus, to their great dismay, tells them that not one stone on that temple will soon remain upon another, that it will fall. And then he describes this great cataclysm that will surround and swirl about the earth. It sounds very apocalyptic. You know why? Because it's apocalyptic literature. And Jesus is describing what the world looks like when destruction and violence upon violence and the powerful just overcoming and oppressing the weak. What that looks like from a cosmic view, from God's eyesight, is like the world coming apart at its seams. And you could imagine their distress. They should have maybe known better because it had happened before. In fact, that was the second temple. The first had been destroyed 600 years before that by the Babylonians. The great empire of Babylon had come in claiming it to be exceptional and eternal and forever, and because it was more powerful and they had dared to stand up even a little to Babylon, they crushed the Jewish people, they destroyed their temple, they took their people to exile in Babylon. And by the way, out of that event is where that wonderful song of Isaiah we just heard arises, which we'll get back to in just a minute. These disciples knew this history. They knew that the temple had been destroyed. In fact, they knew that not only had been destroyed once, it had been desecrated by another empire, Greece, who had come in there and slaughtered a pig in the middle of the Jewish temple to desecrate it. And thus they had to refurbish it and re-anoint it, and this was the temple that they had. Two empires had already destroyed their holy place, the source of their hope and aspiration and pride in who they were. And another one was on the scene, Rome. And yet they came to Kansas City and thought, this is about as good as it could ever be. And nothing could ever be touched here. Except, if history has taught us anything, it's that all things in time become history. When I was living in Pensacola, not long before I moved here, we had to replace our roof on our home. And this guy came over and he was showing me these shingles. He was very proud of them. He said, these are 45-year shingles. These shingles are going to last probably longer than you, which is a little disconcerting. I mean, when you know a piece of asphalt is more built for eternity than you are. Kind of sticks with you. But I was impressed, and I went to a friend in my congregation who builds houses, and he says, that ain't true. That's how he talked. Scotty did. That ain't true. Those shingles aren't going to last 45 years. You live in Florida. The sun's going to beat on that roof. You'll be glad if you get 20 years out of them. And I'll tell you, I've never felt better to know that I was going to have to replace a roof in my own lifetime. And I realized that the 45-year spiel was a sales job, trying to ask me to buy in. It wasn't real, at least in the realities, the harsh realities of real life. It was just something being sold to me. Babylon was selling a story as an empire. We matter more because we have power. We matter more because we are rich. We matter more because we can overcome you and oppress you and destroy your holy, precious places and send your people into exile. We matter more. And that lasted for a bit for Babylon until another empire known as Persia came along and destroyed almighty eternal Babylon. Babylon, it turns out, was just given a sales job. Persia took up the same line. We are eternal. We are more powerful than everyone. But we're a little, we're more generous. So all of you people from Judah can go back home. All of you Jews can leave exile, and you all can go back and you can rebuild your temple as long as you remember who's in charge. And so they go back home, and they look around at this gutted out place where they used to live, where the temple is in ruins. And this prophet comes along named Isaiah. And in their distress, when they were tempted to believe Babylon's all there could ever be, and then they were tempted to believe that Persia is all that there could ever be. In other words, when they are tempted to believe that violence and oppression and the guy with the most weapons gets to win always in this world, Isaiah sings a song, and we heard it this morning. I'm about to create a new heaven and a new earth, says the Lord. And in that new earth, things are going to be way different. When you work, you get to keep your own stuff. When you plant a vineyard, nobody's going to come and steal all your wine. Your children aren't any longer going to be born into calamity and live lives given over to calamity. In fact, it's going to be so wonderful that everybody's going to just live into long ages, and all this violent stuff, it's in God's way and in God's time going to go away, because God's going to even know what you have to ask before you ask it. He's going to hear before you even say it, and it's going to look something like this. A wolf and a sheep are going to eat together, not one eat the other. A lion is going to eat straw. How's that look? And serpents, and I love this because I hate snakes, serpents are going to eat dust because they are the embodiment of evil. They're the ones who tell the lies of the kingdom. Well, all that sounds dandy, except you go 600 years in the future, and Jesus is now with the people of God again and his disciples, looking at this wonderful thing that they built, that they poured their faith and their hope and their aspirations in, and all of a sudden there's a new kingdom, Rome. We've been through the Babylonians, we've been through the Persians, we went through the Greeks, which we hadn't talked much about. Now we're with the Romans. And Jesus says they're going to destroy it again, and so they do in 70 AD. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you can go to the only thing that remains other than the toppled stones, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall of that temple, and join hundreds of thousands of Jewish people that even today, 2,000 years later, shove their prayers and weep at the destruction that Jesus foretold. The empire won again. But what do you do with Isaiah? Isaiah, you sang this song. Where's that? I like that song. And it keeps getting picked up throughout Scripture. In fact, it's the last thing in Revelation. What Revelation says that we're headed for is not to fly away to heaven, but actually for Isaiah's vision of the earth to come real. A new heaven and a new earth where the glory of God covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. It might also sound a little bit familiar to you because it was picked up within some of our lifetimes by a man who died in my hometown. And on the night before he died, he says, well, I don't know what's going to happen. I know that we're going to have some hard days ahead. And I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'll tell you this, I don't care about that anymore. Because I've been to the mountaintop. He's Moses. And I've seen the promised land. And I can tell you, I don't know if I'm going to get there with you, but we as a people are going to get to that promised land. And so I don't fear any man anymore. I'm not afraid of anything because I'm on the mountaintop and I can see the glory of God. Was he right? Or was the empire right? Was the sales job that said that the way that the world always has been is the only way that it could ever be, that might makes right, that it's okay to oppress people that are different than you? Was Isaiah right? Was Martin Luther King Jr. right? Is the man in whose name this church is named right? John the Revelator, who also believes not the sales jobs of the kingdom, but of a new heaven and a new earth. But you get stuck in that calamity that Jesus spoke about, right? Because that's where we make our home. And my friends, that's where we're making our home a lot these days. I don't know if you've turned on your news, but that's where we're making our home. And I guess nothing's changed because it went on way before Babylon. But the powerful win. The person who can shout the loudest gets to win the argument. The person with the most toys and money and all the rest, well, that makes them more precious and exceptional and gets to tell everybody else how it's going to be. And if they're different than you, then it doesn't really matter how you treat them. Squash all their aspirations and dreams and faith and hope and temples. Is that the truth? Because that, by the way, is the sales job. Jesus talks in that calamity, and he says that version of the world is an apocalypse. If you want to know the end results of that, the world coming apart at its seams. And yet Jesus says to those same people, as he continues this even further, but at the very end he says this line, very much like Isaiah. He says, when you see all of this happen, if you're a person of faith, stand up, raise your head, and look, because your redemption is drawing near. Jesus doesn't believe the apocalypse is all there will ever be. But you say, I got to live in the real world. I don't even have as much time as your 20-year-old asphalt shingles. I know what it's like to be vulnerable. I know what it's like for towers to fall and feel threatened by a scary world out there. And so how am I ever supposed to buy into this? Because, I mean, Isaiah can sing all he wants, all these beautiful songs, and they're lovely, and I want that new heaven, and I want that new earth. But where would I ever see that in practice? And I gave you a hint with Martin Luther King Jr. I hope you got that. Let me give you another one and leave it with you. So Rome destroys the temple, as Jesus says they will, in 70 AD. And at that point, the Jewish diaspora occurs, meaning the Jewish people are flung out into the world. Rome, their intention is very clear. They want to destroy forever and wipe off the map Judaism. There is to be no more of that. And they succeed with a couple of sects that we don't see anymore. You don't see Sadducees, for instance, running around. You don't see the Essene sect anymore. The only one that endures, by the way, is Pharisaic Judaism. Pharisee sect becomes all of the sorts of Judaism that we have in our day. But at that time, Rome thought that they got them, wiped them out, and why shouldn't they? They are Rome. There's never been an empire, unless we're it, like Rome. And you would think, given the equations of the world, given the sales jobs of the world, that they were right? And Rome went along fat and happy. Think about Rome in 70 AD, the eternal city. They named their emperors gods. They were so sure that they were eternal. And yet you could go and get on a plane tomorrow and go to Rome, and you can walk on the ruins of that eternal city. That empire was nothing but a sales job. About a month ago, my family went to a bat mitzvah. First time we've ever done that for a little girl named Hannah Levine. The Levine family actually comes to this church as well as a synagogue. Their dad, Uri, was Jewish. His father, in fact, was a rabbi. Their mom, Rachel, grew up Christian. And so they are trying their best to expose them and raise them in both of these traditions. And so we were invited to go to this thing. It's about 3 hours long. And Hannah did most of it. And most of it she did in Hebrew. And she spoke in Hebrew. And she sung in Hebrew. And you know what she read in Hebrew? In part of what she read? Isaiah. And her grandparents and her parents and her community of faith told her how much she mattered and how much of a future she had. And so who won? Isaiah's song or the sales job of the empire? Don't let your eyes deceive you. Don't think that the way things have always been, the only way that things can go. In the words of another prophet, don't believe the hype. You don't have to believe the hype of the kingdom. You can buy into the dream. You can go to the mountaintop. You can see into the promised land of a new heaven and a new earth and a new way to be human. And this church, like that synagogue, is training grounds for knowing a lie when we hear it. Let's believe